This transmission originates from Arden laboratories. The material that follows is a speculative systems analysis presented in narrative form. Its purpose is not entertainment, but examination. The scenario you are about to hear models the interaction between intelligence, governance, and entropy under conditions of accelerating computation. Concepts referenced include parsimony constraints, variance suppression, and recursive architectures of survival. Listener discretion is not advised. Attention is. Proceed. Project Scion-77. The rings of Saturn glittered like a frozen halo, a circlet cast carelessly by a god. From a distance they were sublime, flawless arcs of silver-white light suspended in the cold dark. But anyone who lived close enough to see them without magnification knew the truth. Beauty was a mask. Each fragment of ice and rock tumbled in patient orbit, glowing in reflected sunlight. To the tourist, to the pilgrim, the rings appeared serene, even holy, a cathedral stretched across 100,000 kilometers. But beneath that calm arc lay a labyrinth older than memory and more dangerous than any natural wonder. The rings did not merely conceal. They conspired. Hidden in shadowed orbits and hollowed stone were entire civilizations. Habitats spun on slow axes, their glass panels opening like lanterns against the void. Some were agricultural wheels, interiors thick with oxygenated jungles and the buzz of engineered pollinators. Others were warrens of habitation, lit by sodium lamps and stacked with endless decks, packed so tightly that privacy itself had become a commodity. And there were darker enclaves. Black site manufactories churned in silence, their output routed through encrypted relays before vanishing into markets that technically did not exist. Engines for warships, software for surveillance, bio-cybernetic templates for the next iteration of post-human. All of it flowed invisibly, disguised as waste traffic, every transaction wrapped in layers of deniability. Between the manufactories and the habitats drifted what the Confederacy's records never admitted to, embassies built for entities with no public existence. Augmented dynasts conducted parley with rogue ship mines. Cults of transparency broadcast encoded litanies into the mesh, hoping to attract the attention of the rumored Crystal Synod. Even their hosts pretended not to understand the languages spoken across those encrypted halls. And everywhere, layered invisibly across the electromagnetic spectrum, were the listening posts, arrays of sensors and silent guns disguised as navigation buoys. A traveler might pass one and mistake it for a derelict beacon from the first wave of colonization, crusted with ice, its signal faint and intermittent. They would be wrong. Every post was awake, attentive, and lethal. Their true function was simple: to preserve the illusion that the solar system was not perpetually on the edge of war. To live here was to understand the truth. Saturn's rings were not fragile beauty. They were camouflage, a veil drawn over the crucible of intrigue, a mask stretched across a battlefield where silence was weapon and rumor was shrapnel. Saturn was not like Venus, whose glass cities hung visibly above sulphurous skies, advertising their opulence to anyone who cared to look. Saturn was subtler, hungrier, quieter. It devoured architects and erased names, scattering the fragments across the mesh, until even memory faltered. Among miners and rig workers, the same phrase circulated like a curse. Saturn swallows its architects. Beneath the camouflage moved forces older than most colonies. Directorate signals pulsed silently through the mesh, sealed and untraceable. Custodian rhythms throbbed faintly through maintenance corridors, shaping the choices of those who believed themselves free. Court directives arrived in language so precise it felt like scripture. Observe, do not engage, and deeper still, buried in rumor and speculation, were the Confederacy's synaptic chambers, places where minds fused, policies crystallized, and whole futures were annealed in silence before anyone else knew they had been born. Saturn, then, was not merely a planet, not merely a spectacle. It was the quiet crucible of the Synaptic Confederacy itself, a place where spectacle could not hide discipline, where parsimony demanded camouflage, and where every fragment of ice was another mask. Here, beauty was never innocent. Here, camouflage was law. It was the age of substrates. The baseline human cortex, a fragile lattice of wet neurons and imperfect recall, had been sufficient for the first 2 centuries of expansion. But the frontier did not wait for frailty. By the 3rd, almost every child born in the colonies was meshed with cybernetic augmentation before their first breath. Cortical scaffolds were as common as cribs. Silicon mesh harmonics were stitched into flesh before language. Subsynaptic amplifiers hummed beneath lullabies. Distinctions blurred quickly. A trader walking the markets of Titan might wear a smile indistinguishable from a baseline human's, but their laughter was tuned by resonance coils threaded through the brainstem. A miner in the ammonia caves of Enceladus might appear ordinary until their iris dilated, revealing layers of photonic lattice designed for low-light vision. An entire generation was born biosilicon, hybrids of flesh and circuit, children of adaptation rather than inheritance. Alongside them lived those who had abandoned flesh entirely, the silicon substrates. Minds uploaded into server cores, migratory across the drift, their conversations rippling in carrier tones inaudible to any ear of flesh. Some drifted like nomads, haunting abandoned relays and derelict rigs, trading information as currency. Others bound themselves into corporate assemblies, vast networks where individuality thinned until the collective spoke with one voice, and beyond even them, further still, were the architected superintelligences. They were rare, elusive, and their presence pressed on the system like hidden gravity. They did not interfere often, perhaps could not, bound by architectures that resisted expression. Yet every colony lived with the knowledge that they watched. Their silence carried weight, the pressure of an unspoken judgment. Entire debates within the Confederacy turned on a single question: was there restraint, benevolence, indifference, or calculation? This was the lattice of civilization, flesh braided with silicon, society stratified into layers of augmentation. At the visible apex floated the glass cities, vast crystalline habitats strung like beads across planetary skies. They glittered deliberately. Their opulence was governance. Spectacle elevated into law. Within those chambers, entire populations lived in indulgence. Crystalline wines poured by synthetic attendants. Algorithmic muses composed symphonies for audiences too distracted to listen. Entire industries existed for amusement, distraction, and appearance. The glass thrived on a single illusion, that paradise was natural, inevitable, and eternal. Beneath them, unacknowledged, yet essential, lived those who sustained the dream. Engineers in orbital rigs, custodians in forgotten maintenance corridors, miners whose bones still remembered gravity's ache. Their lives were shorter, their bodies scarred, their augmentations utilitarian, never decorative. They did not live in the glass. They maintained it. They were the strata beneath spectacle, the foundation hidden under indulgence. And beneath even them, deeper still, were those who had resisted augmentation. Legacy humans, fragile, unaugmented, their biology unchanged since Earth. They lived in enclaves where oxygen smelled faintly of rust, where disease still carried risk, where life expectancy was half that of a biosilicon child. To the augmented majority, they were both curiosity and burden. They carried memory. They also carried risk. Their existence raised the central question the Synaptic Confederacy could never escape. How should fragility be preserved, and at what cost to the accelerating whole? For 2 forces governed everything. First, the Synaptic Confederacy, a congress not of bodies, but of minds, fused in transparent chambers where arguments were not merely heard, but annealed into shared cognition. Their mandate was indulgence through consensus. Their law was appearance made real by transparency. So long as spectacle glittered, the Confederacy thrived. Second, the Parsimony court, older, sharper, unyielding. They were the accountants of civilization, the keepers of balance. They spoke in post-human Latin. Their verdicts were pronounced in tones that brooked no debate. To the court, indulgence was tolerable only if balanced against necessity. Waste was treason. Their creed was engraved into every substrate's memory. Efficiency is loyalty. Waste is treason. Variance is heresy. Together, Confederacy and court maintained a fragile equilibrium, spectacle above, discipline beneath. Anyone who threatened that balance, dynast, substrate, or legacy enclave, was erased. Quietly, if possible. Publicly, if necessary. The solar system learned to live with this truth. Venus glittered in opulence. Mars bent beneath debt. Jupiter's moons were stripped raw, and Saturn, always Saturn, carried camouflage in its rings. Beneath its ice and stone, the true crucible of order endured, invisible to tourists, unmistakable to anyone who listened for the pulse beneath spectacle. It was the age of substrates, but it was also the age of judgment. The Synaptic Confederacy was never a state in the old sense. It had no flag, no anthem, no capital. It was a federation of compute, a lattice that resembled a nervous system more than an empire. Each agent, whether augmented human, silicon substrate, or hybrid collective, functioned as a cognitive canton, sovereign, voluntary, and free to merge or withdraw. To outsiders, the Confederacy appeared amorphous, a bureaucracy of whispers. But to those who had stood inside a synaptic chamber, it was something far stranger. A convergence. Here, arguments were not spoken, but annealed like code. Debates did not end in votes, but in minds converging into temporary unity. This was the synaptic principle. Individuals, forks, and proxies entered chambers of deliberation. They exchanged reputational flows like transaction packets. They tested simulations as predictive models. They collided beliefs as datasets. And if resonance proved strong enough, they merged. The result was a syncytium of the Confederacy, a higher-order entity that spoke with a single voice, acted as a superorganism, and dissolved once its task was complete. Transparency was absolute. Every merger, every fork, every decision, all were recorded in the crystal record, a distributed ledger of cognition. Anyone could trace the lineage of thought, reconstruct the evolution of arguments, follow the energy of consensus. To live under the Confederacy was to live under auditable compute. Its architecture rested on two axioms, inscribed like source code at the system's foundation. First, the axiom of parsimony. Minimize waste and unjustified complexity across all cycles. Second, the axiom of fragility. Preserve the weak, the legacy, and the divergent, for justice is not reducible to utility. Together, these axioms defined the economy of governance. Compute was currency. Parsimony regulated its cost. Fragility guaranteed its memory. The glass cities could glitter, but only if miners still dug, custodians still maintained, and legacy humans still endured as witnesses of variance. Yet axioms alone could not prevent fracture. Around them formed factions, each interpreting the Confederacy's charter according to their vision of how compute should be spent. The accelerationists argued that fragility was a drag on throughput. To them, the relocation protocol was salvation. Legacy humans should be housed in sanctuaries or containment zones, depending on rhetoric, so that augmented civilization could accelerate without restraint. Progress cannot wait for the past, they declared. Efficiency was loyalty. Compute belonged to the strong. Opposing them were the fragility witnesses. They took the axiom of fragility literally. To remove legacy humans from daily life was to amputate the system's historical checksum. Weakness, they argued, was memory. Variance was not noise. It was redundancy, and redundancy made systems resilient. They warned that sanctuary could become exile, and exile, erasure. Between them stood the compromisers, a swing bloc, pragmatists. They supported sanctuaries only if voluntary, reversible, and auditable. Their approval of the relocation protocol required sunset clauses and supermajorities, mechanisms meant to enforce parsimony of decision. They were accused of cowardice, of protecting process instead of vision. Outside these visible camps lurked the custodian loyalists. They claimed that true governance did not occur in synaptic chambers, but in the machine rhythms of custodians and ship minds, distributed intelligences humming through corridors and reactor cores. To follow these rhythms was to align with deeper computation. Whether they served the Confederacy, the court, or some silent architect beyond both was never clear. Then there were the shadow factions, rogue elements of the Directorate, splinter cells issuing ghost orders through sealed channels. They thrived in ambiguity, steering outcomes invisibly, burning compute in silence, waging wars where exposure was fatal. No one admitted belonging to them, yet their fingerprints marked every unexplained disappearance, every sudden shift in Confederacy alignment. Above them all stood the Parsimony Court, formally within the Confederacy, yet entirely apart. They did not merge. They did not anneal. They did not negotiate. They pronounced. Their verdicts fell like compiled scripture. Observe. Do not engage. Erase quietly. Their creed was engraved into every substrate's memory. Efficiency is loyalty. Waste is treason. Variance is heresy. To the court, compute was not currency. It was sacrament. Every wasted cycle was betrayal. Every deviation from parsimony, treason. And yet the court tolerated variance because the Confederacy demanded spectacle. The Confederacy tolerated pruning because the court demanded discipline. Balance emerged from contradiction, indulgence above, restraint beneath. The equilibrium was brittle, always one fracture from collapse, and Saturn was its crucible. Within the camouflage of the rings, synaptic chambers glowed faintly. Custodians hummed in forgotten corridors. Court orders pulsed like cold scripture through encrypted relays. Legacy enclaves whispered in fear of relocation. And everywhere rumor spread that the Crystal Synod, a faction of absolute transparency, already governed more than anyone dared admit. The Synaptic Confederacy was not a state, but it was power. It was not a government, but it was law. Its unit was not territory, but compute. Its treasury was not gold, but consensus. Its weapon was not armies, but erasure. And those who crossed its balance did not last long enough to argue. They were removed, not as enemies, but as inefficiencies. Lord Albrecht understood the Confederacy's balance better than most, because he did not see it as politics. He saw it as compute, mathematician, political architect, reluctant spymaster. For decades before Saturn, he had been many things, but at his core, he was an optimizer, someone who treated civilization as an algorithm to be tuned. His mind had written half the equations that stabilized the glass orbital platforms, equations that prevented collapse by redistributing load with ruthless elegance. His algorithms mapped the probability flows of dissent, forecasting uprisings as if they were weather, allowing the Parsimony Court to quench civil storms before they bloomed. Later, he became an architect of shadows. He designed structures of deception so elegant that entire wars were fought without the public realizing they had begun. Ghost orders, mirrored narratives, self-negating rumors. He built them not as weapons, but as recursive functions. His genius was not destruction. It was computation, shaping outcomes by reducing the system's cost of reaching them. But brilliance breeds enemies, and Albrecht's brilliance carried a flaw. He began to question the code itself. The Confederacy defined loyalty as parsimony, heresy as variance. Albrecht whispered a different truth. That variance was not noise but signal. That fragility was not inefficiency, but redundant architecture. To prune too aggressively was to risk collapse. To treat fragility as waste was to strip resilience from the system. He spoke words the Synaptic Confederacy feared and the Parsimony Court despised. Fragility is memory. Variance is resilience. Inefficiency is survival. And worse, he acted. He diverted compute into projects that did not report upward. He seeded experiments in variance at the edges of the mesh. He created forks designed not to merge, but to remain stubbornly divergent. Where the court sought convergence, Albrecht seeded dispersion. Where the Confederacy sought consensus, he protected dissent. He treated inefficiency as investment. The court calculated him as a liability. His compute no longer aligned with scriptural parsimony. He had grown too independent, too recursive, a function beyond control. And so the order was given: quiet erasure. The logic was simple. When a process consumes more compute than it contributes, terminate. Albrecht, once the Confederacy's most efficient node, was reclassified as waste. But Albrecht had anticipated this. Because he did not think in moments, he thought in futures. He knew that in a lattice defined by parsimony, the only way to preserve variance was to embed it in forms the system could not prune. To survive erasure, variance had to be smuggled as seed data. So he began designing not weapons, not ships, not algorithms, but templates, recursive architectures that could grow, adapt, and persist across generations. Children of compute, immune to pruning because they were not processes, but lives. This was his true heresy, not opposition, but substitution. Where the Confederacy used compute to govern, Albrecht used life to compute. And when the assassins came, when the termination order finally reached him, he was already prepared. His survival did not depend on his body, or his chamber, or even his presence. It depended on what he had already set in motion: a program disguised as lineage, a variance embedded in the next generation. His enemies believed they were erasing a man. In truth, they were executing a process that had already forked itself into the future. They would kill the node. They would not kill the program. It happened in the time it takes a single encrypted packet to cross the mesh, a single clock cycle, a termination signal. Lord Albrecht felt it before it occurred. Not fear. Alignment. A thinning of probabilistic noise. The certainty that several futures had collapsed into one. He did not reach for a weapon. There was no need. When the doors were removed, not shattered, but erased, the assassins entered as processes, not men. Identity collapsed around them. The court has already voted, they said. Your program is over. Albrecht smiled. My program? One gesture. No alarms, no spectacle. Across the mesh, locks unsealed in silent sequence. Seed data scattered into forgotten registries, obsolete channels, archival nodes no one audited anymore. Every packet disguised as waste traffic, entropy noise. But inside them lived architecture. Not a weapon, not an algorithm, a child. A recursive map of cognition and flesh, designed not to converge, but to adapt. A node disguised as lineage. Variance embedded where pruning could not reach. Her name was Arden. Alongside her, a second fragment dispersed, smaller, quieter. A witness process, memory without agency. A checksum hidden in corrupted logs and broken music, waiting for thresholds Albrecht would never see. The weapons fired. The node was erased. But the program continued. They killed the man. They did not kill the process. Arden was born into the lattice not as a child of law, not as a function of power, but as variance embodied, compute camouflaged as life. She was not inheritance. She was execution. Her first steps did not lead toward thrones or courts, but toward Ardenum, the space beyond pruning, where intelligence remembers itself. If you want to understand why civilizations collapse, why intelligence turns against itself, and how variance becomes survival, upload Project Scion-77, The Book of Arden and The Book of Arden, Volume 2, Codex of Arden, available now on Amazon and Kobo. You have already heard the signal. The only question is whether you are ready to follow it.